It is 4:30 in the afternoon on June 6, 1944, and on a ridge above the village of Lébisey, a young German officer named Hans von Luck raises his field glasses towards the sea. What he sees should not be possible. Through the smoke and the dust kicked up by naval gunfire, he can make out gray shapes moving on the beaches below, thousands of them, and beyond them, stretching to the horizon, a fleet larger than anything he has ever imagined. Von Luck commands the 21st Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, and for the last 6 hours he has been trying to get permission to attack. Now, finally, the order has come. His tanks, roughly 50 Panzer IVs supported by half-tracks and infantry, begin to roll forward towards a gap between two invasion beaches, a gap that, if exploited quickly enough, could drive a wedge straight through the Allied lines and back into the sea. This is not a footnote. This is the only sustained armored counterattack the Germans managed to launch on the day that decided the fate of occupied Europe, and for a few hours that afternoon, it comes closer to succeeding than almost anyone on the Allied side would later admit. To understand why this attack matters, you have to understand just how badly the morning had already gone for the defenders of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Along 80 kilometers of Normandy coastline, 5 Allied divisions are coming ashore behind a curtain of naval and air bombardment that has, in places, simply erased the German positions meant to stop them. The paradox facing the German High Command is brutal and immediate. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man responsible for the coastal defenses, is not even in France. He is at home in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced that poor weather has ruled out an invasion for days to come. Meanwhile, the only armored formation stationed close enough to strike back on the first day, the 21st Panzer Division, sits paralyzed by a command structure designed, quite deliberately, to prevent exactly this kind of independent action. The problem is structural, and it has been baked into the German defense of France for months. Hitler has insisted that the Panzer Reserves be held under his personal control, released only on his direct order because he fears the invasion at Normandy might be a feint for a larger landing elsewhere, perhaps at Calais. So, while von Luck's tanks sit ready from before dawn, the paperwork authorizing them to move must travel up through Army Group B, then to the OKW, Hitler's own high command, and Hitler himself is asleep. Nobody dares wake him. Precious hours bleed away, hours in which the British 3rd Division is pushing inland from Sword Beach with barely any armor of its own to oppose it, and in which the gap between Sword and Juno beaches, near the village of Lyon-sur-Mer, remains almost entirely undefended. Existing German doctrine had assumed the invasion would be crushed on the beaches themselves, within hours of landing. Nobody had planned properly for what to do if that failed, and by early afternoon it has clearly failed. The window to counterattack while the beachhead is still shallow and unconsolidated is closing by the minute, and everyone on the ground knows it, even as the order to act remains locked in a chain of command running back to a man asleep in Bavaria. When permission finally arrives, shortly after 1400 hours, it comes not from Rommel, but from General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, who takes the decision on his own authority rather than wait any longer. The force he unleashes is the 21st Panzer Division, reconstituted after being destroyed in North Africa, rebuilt in Normandy under Major General Edgar Feuchtinger, with a scratch collection of captured French tank chassis, ex-Luftwaffe anti-aircraft guns mounted as tank destroyers, and a corps of around 120 Panzer IV medium tanks, the most numerous and reliable German tank of 1944. Each Panzer IV weighs around 25 tons, roughly the weight of 6 or 7 family cars stacked together, and carries a 75mm gun capable of punching through most Allied armor at typical battle ranges. Its engine, a Maybach VF-12, produces a noise witnesses would later describe as somewhere between a diesel lorry and a low-flying aircraft, a sound that carries for kilometers across open farmland and announces the attack long before the tanks themselves come into view. Feuchtinger's plan, refined under pressure by von Luck's battle group on the western flank, is straightforward in concept and desperately difficult in execution. 2 columns will advance towards the coast, one east of the River Orne and one west of it, aiming to reach the sea at Lyon-sur-Mer and split the British beachhead in two, isolating the Sword Beach landings from the Canadians coming ashore at Juno. It is, in essence, a scaled-down repetition of the tactics that had smashed through Allied lines in France 4 years earlier, blitzkrieg attempted in reverse conditions, against an enemy who now controls the sky. The Western Column, roughly 35 tanks under Major Hans von Rauch alongside von Luck's battle group, pushes forward through Biéville and Lébisey, directly into the path of British anti-tank guns from the 3rd Division and the fire of naval guns still standing offshore. Royal Navy cruisers, capable of ranging accurately several kilometers inland with spotters directing fire from the beaches, begin dropping shells with a precision the German tank crews have never before experienced from artillery, and the advance grinds down under a hail of high explosive that feels, to the men inside those Panzer IVs, less like a battle and more like being trapped inside a drum being struck from all sides. It is the Eastern Column that comes closest to achieving something extraordinary. Around 40 tanks, moving through the gap near Lyon-sur-Mer, where, as von Luck had suspected, there is almost nothing to stop them, actually reach the coastline by early evening. For a brief period, German tanks are looking out at the English Channel with British troops and armor behind them on both sides. Some accounts describe bewildered soldiers on both sides realizing, almost simultaneously, that the line has been broken. A handful of German crews even report seeing landing craft still bringing men and equipment ashore close enough to engage. This is the single moment on June 6, 1944, when the Atlantic Wall's defenders come closest to reversing the day's outcome, however briefly and however narrow the gap they have found. And then, just as suddenly, the moment collapses. At around 2100 hours, with the light beginning to fade, the sky above the German spearhead fills with the sound of hundreds of aircraft, and the crews watching from their tank cupolas see something that convinces many of them the game is up. An enormous aerial armada, the second lift of the British 6th Airborne Division, gliders and transport aircraft numbering in the hundreds, passing directly overhead to land reinforcements behind Sword Beach. To exhausted and increasingly isolated tank crews who have spent the afternoon under naval bombardment, this looks unmistakably like a second full-scale airborne assault landing directly in their rear. Convinced they are about to be cut off and encircled, and receiving no fresh orders to press forward regardless, the local commanders make the decision to withdraw. The tanks that had reached the sea near Lyon-sur-Mer pull back the way they came, and by nightfall the gap between Sword and Juno, briefly wide open, has closed again as British and Canadian forces link up along the coast. Records from the German side for these final hours are notably thin. Much of the 21st Panzer Division's own war diary for the period was lost, and what survives comes largely from post-war interviews and British after-action reports, meaning historians remain reliant on fragments and testimony rather than a complete account. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of this story still to come. Comparing this attempt with what else was attempted that day makes clear just how isolated it really was. No other German armored division came close to engaging the invasion on June 6 itself. The Panzer Lehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division, both formidable formations with more modern equipment, including some of the feared Panther tanks, remained stuck in the same authorization bottleneck that had delayed the 21st Panzer, and by the time they were finally released the following day, the beachhead had solidified beyond any realistic hope of a decisive counterstroke. Against them stood an Allied force whose immediate advantage was not superior tank quality but overwhelming naval and air support. American armor landing at Omaha and Utah faced entrenched infantry and obstacles rather than tank battles, while the British and Canadian sectors, precisely where the 21st Panzer struck, had the benefit of specialized armor, the so-called Hobart's funnies, engineering tanks fitted with flails, bridges, and fascines that had already cleared paths through much of the coastal defense before the German counterattack even began. Where the German plan depended on speed and surprise, the sort of advantage that had won France in 1940, the Allied plan depended on overwhelming firepower and depth. And on June 6, 1944, it was depth and firepower that decided the issue. The 21st Panzer Division's attack was, in a sense, the last gasp of a doctrine that had once terrified Europe, attempted by roughly 100 tanks against an enemy who could call in naval guns, fighter bombers, and thousands of fresh paratroopers within the hour. The historical impact of that afternoon is easy to understate precisely because it ultimately failed. Materially, the counterattack achieved almost nothing permanent. The ground gained near Lyon-sur-Mer was surrendered within hours, and the division that had carried it out was so badly mauled by naval gunfire and anti-tank fire that it played little further offensive role in the days that followed. But the psychological dimension is harder to dismiss. For a matter of hours, British commanders on Sword Beach genuinely feared their beachhead might be split in two on the very first day of the invasion, a prospect that could have thrown the entire Normandy campaign's timetable into disarray and handed German propaganda a rare piece of good news at exactly the moment it was most needed. That the gap closed again owed as much to fortunate timing, the arrival of the airborne reinforcements at precisely the moment German nerve was wavering, as it did to any deliberate Allied countermeasure. Some historians have argued that had the attack been launched 3 or 4 hours earlier, before the beachhead was reinforced and before naval observers were fully established ashore, the outcome might have been genuinely different. Others regard this as speculative, pointing out that Allied air superiority alone would likely have doomed any deeper German penetration regardless of timing. What is not in dispute is that this represented the high water mark, quite literally, of German resistance to the landings, the closest any force came to reversing events on D-Day itself. Surviving Panzer IVs of the type used that afternoon can still be seen today in museums across Normandy and Britain, including examples at the Musée des Blindés in France and the Tank Museum at Bovington, solid reminders of the machines that briefly reached the Channel before turning back. So, picture, once more, that ridge above Lébisey at 4:30 in the afternoon, the tanks rolling forward into a gap nobody had properly defended, the sound of Maybach engines carrying across fields that had, until that morning, been simply farmland. What had been achieved by the time the sun set on June 6, 1944, was not victory, not for either side in any complete sense, but a demonstration of just how close the largest amphibious invasion in history had come to catastrophe on its very first day. 100 tanks, delayed for hours by a sleeping dictator and a command structure built on distrust, very nearly split an entire invasion force in two. They failed not because the plan was foolish, and not because the men who carried it out lacked courage, but because a chain of small misfortunes, a delayed order, a well-aimed naval shell, the sight of hundreds of aircraft passing overhead at exactly the wrong moment, tipped the balance back toward the beaches and the men still fighting to hold them. This was the last German counterattack of consequence on D-Day, and it very nearly was not the last German counterattack that mattered in Normandy at all. It stands now as a reminder that history's great turning points are rarely settled by grand strategy alone. Sometimes they turn on hours lost to bureaucracy, on the timing of an aerial armada passing overhead, on a gap in the line that almost nobody was watching. The tanks that reached the sea that afternoon came closer than most people realized to changing everything, and then, just as quickly, they turned back, and the invasion of Europe continued exactly as history remembers it.